My name is Ingram. I worked with John in the late 60s, early 70s, probably about one short generation ahead of son. John's research typically incorporated sort of the thematic of a lot of what's been said so far, much of the complexity of the real world. He seldom dealt with sparse analytic models with closed-form solutions. More often, his models represented as much complexity as was feasible given the limits of data and other capacities. One of his rules was not to utilize simplifying assumptions that were at variance with reality. And this is not something that's popular in economics. It's really a challenge to come up with a kind of intermediate scale simplification. Let's call it meso-simplification. Let me illustrate it with an anecdote. John and I were giving a paper on the NDER urban simulation model in Cambridge, and Bob Solo was discussing. And Bob made a sort of, he's a very trenchant comment. He quoted Lewis Carroll. And Lewis Carroll once said, "A map on the scale of 1 to 1 is not very useful." And the implication was we had constructed a map more or less on the scale of 1 to 1. It's also the case that a map on the scale of 1,000,000 to 1 is not very useful. But a really interesting intellectual challenge that many of us face is getting that scale of the maps right. And I want to argue that a lot of what's a common thread to his work is that he was working in this sort of intermediate range, and it's a very challenging issue. It's really very difficult. It's much more difficult than closed-form analytic solution, but it's kind of pervades his work, and that's the thematic of my comments today. That sort of working in this intermediate scale, and I think it's particularly relevant to the public policy profession, more so than economists. That getting that right is critical if you want to analyze policy issues. And one of the things you can see when you look at John's work is his skill at doing that. Now, it's no accident that this approach works really well in urban economics. It's a field where many attributes are often assumed away. Many of the key issues in urban are assumed away in analytically tractable models. These are issues like, or factors like durable capital stocks, interdependent decision-making, of which racial discrimination is one manifestation of interdependent decision-making. Sort of two-dimensional representations of space. We're still working on three-dimensional representations of space. Scale economies and discrete as opposed to continuous variables. Those are all issues that are really manifest in various kinds of externalities in urban analysis. And if you want to get it right, you've really got to address those. Anyway, what I want to do, I want to talk about three areas that, two of which have been discussed already to sort of sketch this out a little bit. One is the analysis of urban housing markets, second, urban transportation, and third, an area that hasn't been mentioned very much is John also did some interesting work on urban environmental issues, particularly air quality. But first on urban housing markets, John worked for over 10 years, probably 15 years, on the development of computer-based simulation models of urban housing markets. This work began at the National Bureau of Economic Research in the late 60s. The model was then known as the NDER urban simulation model. We were into branding. Then it moved to Cambridge and it became the Harvard Urban Development Model. There's a Texas Schools Project. There's another thematic here as well. As John quickly noted, these models are spatially disaggregated. They have many residential and workplace zones. They have different types of housing, different types of households, transport networks, and often local public goods, what we call neighborhood quality. And they incorporate stylized representations. This is the meso-simplification point. real geography, real transport networks, multi-centric employment locations, existing capital stocks, and their transformation over time. Now, in addition to the modeling, John managed this model-oriented research program starting at the Bureau, and it involved two distinct but closely related activities. First of all, there was a group of us who were sort of building the model, trying to figure out how to represent market clearing and so on and so forth. But going along with that was a very extensive program of empirical work to estimate or inform model parameters. And his genius was to use the modeling framework as a rubric to organize an awful lot of empirical work, a lot of dissertations, and people looking at questions that the importance of which weren't obvious until you saw how they fit together into this larger model. This included analysis of, for example, the decisions that households make to move from one residential location to another or from one job place to another. Analysis of maintenance and upgrading decisions of households and landlords and of the working of urban land markets. Studies of local public goods and its determinants. At this time, there was very little information, very little empirical work on locational aspects of labor market activity beyond that was already done by John. And let me say, the model that we constructed took the workplace as fixed and modeled the housing market based on that. John and I had many discussions about the dual model, which is the model where you fix the residential locations and you search the labor market. And of course, in the same way that you get rents associated with different locations, you also get wage differences associated with different workplaces. So we never built that model, but there's a sense in which that's the model. The dual of the urban simulation model is the model that John used in his work on segregation, and he was very well aware of that. There are a number of folks who were involved in that. Some of them are sitting here in this room. Jim Brown, Stephen Dresch, Royce, Franklin James, Raymond Strike, John Quigley, myself. Later, Bill Apgar and Bob Schaefer were heavily engaged. Bob particularly on the sort of maintenance issues. In any case, over a period of years, this model was constructed, it was deconstructed, it was rebuilt, parameter estimates were refined. The model started out using an accounting framework. We were basically hypnotized by matrices at that time. We had these summary tables, and it was essentially using an accounting framework. That broke down, and we transformed the model into a microanalytic simulation model, and we tracked basically 40,000 households and 40,000 plus dwelling units and jobs and so on and so forth. And this model was used in particularly the late 70s and early 80s to do a number of policy analyses, looking at housing allowance programs, neighborhood change, transport investments, and so forth. Now the model, in some sense, was the kind of concrete and obvious product of this. But frankly, the systematic empirical work that was organized around the modeling framework was certainly as important and probably more important in the long run. I should say, anecdotally, and I went on to do a lot of work internationally, a large number of the empirical findings in the United States have been reproduced in lots and lots of cities around the world. The outcomes are so similar, it's actually remarkable. Second thing I want to talk about is picking up this sort of meso-level approach and putting it down in the area of urban transport. As others have noted, John was heavily engaged in urban transport throughout his career. His interest, as was noted earlier, was really related to his interest in housing markets and labor markets and their interaction. But he's an economist, and economists are dedicated to the importance of efficiency. And I think it was John's concern about efficiency that really drove him heavily to continue his work after the work with Myers and Wall on the urban transportation problem. He became engaged in a long campaign in support of buses, exclusive bus lanes, as an alternative to more expensive metro investments. But this work involved, it goes back to the meso business, it involved detailed modeling in specific cities using city-based parameters. This was not a kind of one-size-fits-all kind of generic approach that he had. He would go in and get the data and build a network and sit down and talk to the planners and so on and so forth. And there was an awful lot of this work. John quickly mentioned a number of cities: Tehran, Santiago, Singapore, Jakarta, Bangkok, Bogota, plus Cleveland, Dallas, Houston, and Boston. There are a number of people who, again, some of you were in the room here, who worked with him on this: Michael Beasley, Robert Emsley, Gary Fout, Andy Hamer, Ken Hansen, Arnold Howard, Tony Gomez-Ibanez, Don Pickrell. Some of you may not know, in the late 80s, he did an important paper. It doesn't show up on the citation counts, obviously. He worked for the Inter-American Development Bank and went to a number of cities in Latin America and wrote a paper looking basically on transport systems in Latin America. And his contributions there played a really important role in laying the intellectual foundation that's helped support bus systems in Latin cities, including an extremely successful bus system in Bogota called the Transmilenio bus system, which is an exclusive busway system that's functioning in Bogota. I mean, somebody said it wasn't clear what the effect of his work was. I would say maybe there's a saying, "No man is a prophet in his own land," and it's conceivable that that's relevant here. The third thing I wanted to talk about briefly was the work on environment, particularly urban environmental issues. He became involved in this in the early 70s, looking at the air quality impacts of transportation in cities, looking at the cost effectiveness of alternative transport and land use policies in terms of their impacts on air quality. Again, sort of meso-level, detailed models, cold start emissions, parking schemes, all sorts of detailed policy interventions. This work was sort of institutional and multidisciplinary. It was a peculiar group of us. It was some economists from Harvard, some mechanical engineers from MIT, and some lawyers from Columbia. And the benefit for me of that, I learned what the definition of a stoichiometric ratio was from friends at MIT. This is thermodynamics. But in any case, what this work did is it combined spatially detailed urban models of workplaces and so on and so forth, inventories of stationary source emissions, transportation systems, emission factors, and so on and so forth. The results of this work have stood the test of time fairly well, and what the work demonstrated was that, in fact, reducing tailpipe emissions was really very cost effective, particularly relative to changes in land use and parking schemes and so on and so forth. What we learned from this work was that a lot of these other transport interventions and land use interventions basically move the pollution around. So you can in fact reduce the pollution in the center city, but you sort of moved it somewhere else. There's a sort of hydraulic aspect to that. You push it down here and it pops up somewhere else. And again, this work was built on local information, particularly from Boston and Los Angeles. I have to say I'm now in the evaluation business, and one of the sort of reflexive things that you do in the evaluation business is you always have to have lessons at the end of an intervention. So I have a couple of lessons. What did I learn from working with John? The first point is, I think it's a more elegant way to say this, but in research, as in many other activities, some costs don't matter. And this is really related to this business of moving to the meso level. It means that you're willing to try different approaches. You're willing to try approaches where all the employment is not in the center of the city, and so on and so forth. But essentially, you observe the world, and you observe the data, and you build models that are consistent with reality. I have to say that John always followed the data. He always had his eye on reality. The comments made earlier by Glaser about the focus on suburbanization, the focus on race, and so on and so forth in his urban work, is very much along the lines of, of following the data and ignoring the precedents. The second lesson I've learned working for him is, in the world, the ratio of analysis to data is too low. And the implication of that is you don't work on the denominator, you work on the numerator. And the interesting thing about virtually all the work that John did, I only know of one case where John actually went and collected data and interviewed households, and that was this sort of landlord maintenance survey he did. But most of the other work that he's done has used data that has been collected by others. And he was just an inveterate user of data collected by others, and that's something to think about as you do research. You have to be more. It takes more ingenuity, but it really pays off. Related to this point, the sort of third lesson. This is a very specific application of this rule, and that is, when you're working in the United States, always try and use census data. Okay. It's available for all the cities. Although a lot of us started out using what I call idiosyncratic data sets, the sort of Detroit, San Francisco, Chicago, and so on and so forth. That helped, but it was actually an impediment because it was very difficult to test your results across cities. As well, the questionnaire is different, so it was very, very difficult to sort of test the robustness of results. And once you move to census data, it really becomes easy. John taught an undergraduate urban course at Harvard for a long time, and there's at least one person in here who's taken that course. And John had his students always do a paper using census data, using census tract data. And we would send the undergraduates into the library, and they'd go to the little used census volumes in the library and use it. So he really practiced what he preached. The fourth rule, sort of fourth lesson, is that I learned from John, is really, it's on the personal side, and that is, you should really take a long view in your professional work. You should use a low discount rate in interpersonal relations. This means being generous in acknowledging the contributions of coworkers. John did an awful lot of joint work, and many of us who worked with him tried to be as generous with our coworkers eventually as he was with us. It means giving a large weight to the interests of others, being helpful to colleagues, and thoughtful with advice. John followed these practices well, and many of us in this room, I think, were privileged. Sure.